Just after 1 o'clock in the morning on February 27th, 1995, Johnny and Dana Chisholm received a phone call at their home in Rock Hill, South Carolina. The strange man on the other end of the phone spoke loudly and quickly, as if he was almost excited to be talking to them, identifying himself as Lieutenant Lewis Douglas with the Metropolitan Police Department. The man said that he was calling on behalf of Johnny and Jogari's daughter, Dana, who was 25 years old at the time and living more than 400 miles away in Washington, D.C. Through bated breath, the man calling himself Lieutenant Douglas described how Dana had been arrested for prostitution during a sting at the Omni Hotel and thought it best for them to know, despite the call making Dana upset while she sat behind bars. Before hanging up, the man gave Dana's parents a phone number for them to call should they need to, but said that Dana would call them herself after being arraigned and released in the morning. Dana Chisholm had a hard time believing that the man who had called them in the early morning hours had been a police officer, simply because of the way he spoke. But Johnny and his wife would be unable to get in touch with Dana for the rest of the morning. A while later, suspicion began to get the better of Johnny, and he decided to return the man's call at the number he had provided. Lieutenant Lewis Douglas answered the phone, but sounded remarkably different. During the span of this conversation, the Chisholms discovered that the man who had called them hours beforehand had not been Lewis Douglas, but had only been pretending to be. The real Lewis Douglas, who actually was a police lieutenant in the nation's capital, had never spoken to them before and had no idea what they were talking about. For some reason though, the anonymous caller, who had called them just after 1 o'clock in the morning, had provided the Chisholms with the real Lieutenant Douglas's work number, perhaps to add a veneer of authenticity to his call. Surprisingly though, the real Lieutenant Douglas did know Dana, the Chisholm's daughter that the anonymous caller had claimed was picked up for prostitution the night before. While there was no record of her having been arrested at all, Lieutenant Douglas had been to Dana's home in northwestern D.C. weeks prior. That was when she had called the police to report that her television had been stolen, with Lieutenant Douglas having gone out to file a police report for the missing TV. But he claimed to have not been in contact with Dana since then. Fearing that something might have happened to her, the Chisholms asked if Lieutenant Douglas could check in on Dana. He agreed to, making a few calls to Dana's employer and known acquaintances, who all hadn't heard anything. Later that day, Douglas would check in on Dana at her apartment, leaving behind a business card with his name and contact info, along with a note that read, "I'll be back," which he left on the woman's apartment door. Little did he know, the young woman he was looking for was still inside of her apartment, but had been dead for several hours at this point. The clues left behind pointed to a convoluted whodunit that remains unsolved nearly 3 decades later. This is the story of Dana Chisholm. Dana Vonda Chisholm was born in York County, South Carolina on August 30th, 1969, to her parents Johnny and Jogari Love Chisholm. The oldest of 3 siblings, Dana would have 1 younger brother, Trevor, and 1 sister, Lacey. Dana would grow up with her family in Rock Hill, the largest city in York County and the 5th largest city in South Carolina, which is in the northern section of the state, near the North Carolina border. While details of her early life aren't widely known, we do know that Dana was rather intelligent and hardworking, and enjoyed both dancing and cheerleading. Family recall that she read everything she could get her hands on, and as described by her uncle, William Chisholm, to the Washington Post, she was a real bright girl, and she always liked doing adult things. Despite having a good head on her shoulders, Dana did have some troubles during her teenage years. She reportedly got interested in drugs at one point, and even ran away from home, but eventually returned home and graduated from Northwestern High School in 1987. The following year, Dana began attending King's Business College in Charlotte and would graduate a few years later in 1993. Later that year, Dana made her biggest move yet, moving out of the Carolinas to the nation's capital of Washington, D.C., where she had ambitions of becoming a professional singer. According to those that knew her, Dana was incredibly talented, and some even likened her voice to that of Whitney Houston. But singing only pays the bills for very few, so Dana had to pick up a day job to support herself in the meantime. Dana ended up finding a job at the Hudson Institute, a conservative think tank in Washington, D.C., where she worked as a secretary. Michael J. Horowitz, her boss, later described to the Washington Post, "She was a bright young woman with such intelligence and a 1,000-watt smile. At the same time, I had a sense that there was some troublesome aspect to her life." Some of Dana's fellow coworkers recall her being late often and occasionally absent, but seeming distraught or distracted some of the time. Despite this, however, she was seemingly well-liked by almost everyone she knew, with not many having a bad word to say about her. Dana lived at an apartment at 3808 Argyle Terrace Northwest, in the northern section of town, near Rock Creek Park. There, she rented the basement from a woman that lived in the upper portion of the home with her son. This was a relatively affluent neighborhood at the time, with it being reported that one of their neighbors was the former director of the FBI, William Sessions, along with Senator Jay Rockefeller, who lived just down the street. Sadly, it was here, in this supposedly safe neighborhood, that Dana's life would come to an end less than 18 months after moving to DC. On February 27th, 1995, the same day that Dana's parents had received a phone call from someone pretending to be Metropolitan Police Lieutenant Louis Douglas, the real Lieutenant Douglas had stopped by Dana's apartment, looking for her. Sadly, though, he had found no trace of Dana there, with the young woman not answering her door or responding to attempted phone calls. Lieutenant Douglas left behind a note and a business card on Dana's door, but seemed to have left it at that. At around 6 p.m., Dana's co-workers at the Hudson Institute reached out to Dana's landlady, Cynthia Ford, who lived upstairs above Dana's rented basement. Because she had not shown up to work that day and had not told anyone her whereabouts, these coworkers were worried for Dana and wondered if Cynthia could check in her apartment to see if she was okay. Cynthia agreed to do so, entering in through Dana's apartment door to look for any trace of her tenant. Moments later, inside of the littered apartment, Cynthia discovered Dana lying face up on the hallway floor near her bedroom. Authorities were called to the scene, and Metropolitan Police began to arrive at the property at approximately 7 p.m. Dana, who at first had been believed to be merely unconscious, was visibly deceased. According to Sergeant Michael Farish of the Metro P.D., who spoke to reporters with South Carolina's The Herald, she appeared to have been dead for a while prior to us finding her. The medical examiner estimated that Dana had been deceased for approximately 24 hours before her discovery, putting her time of death at around 9 p.m. the day before she was found, on February 26th. It was believed that she had been asphyxiated to death with a cord, which was still wrapped around her neck at the time her body was found. She might have been raped, but authorities never publicly revealed whether she had been or not. Shockingly, though, it was later determined during the autopsy that Dana had been approximately 4 weeks pregnant at the time of her death. Investigators with the Metro P.D. began investigating Dana's death inside of her apartment, finding that there was no sign of a broken window or door. There wasn't any sign of forced entry for that matter. However, not too far away from her apartment, a key was discovered by a TV reporter reporting upon the case, which was later found to be a key to Dana's apartment. Investigators weren't sure whether this was a spare key she had left outside in case of emergencies, which the killer had found or stumbled upon perhaps, or if this was a key that she might have given to someone that she at one point trusted. It was reported that a note had been found on the back door to Dana's apartment, which read, "I'll be back." This was later determined to have been a note left behind by Lieutenant Louis Douglas, who had attempted to get in touch with Dana earlier that day, February 27th, when he left behind the note along with a business card of his. However, it was reported that Douglas had left behind the note on the front door of the property, with it being theorized that the killer had moved the note to the back door for whatever reason. However, Lieutenant Douglas has refused to speak to reporters in the years since, so it's unknown if this was fact or if this was merely a rumor. Surprisingly, none of Dana's neighbors had recalled seeing or hearing anything out of the ordinary on the night that she lost her life. Not even her upstairs neighbors, who rented out their basement to Dana. Despite this being a rather affluent community, full of neighbors who knew each other, no one had seen or heard anyone suspicious coming or going on the evening of February 26, 1995, nor the following morning, February 27th. Now, we're going to pause for just a moment to hear a word from today's sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by Caliper CBD. One of my favorite things in the world is to be lazy. I hate to say it, but it's true. And sadly, as the dad of a newborn with a wife in the military, I don't really get a lot of time to be lazy anymore. However, one product does allow me to be lazy in its own way: Caliper CBD. Caliper's dissolvable CBD powder has absolutely no flavor, and it's more effective than CBD oils because it's clinically proven to deliver 30 times more CBD in the first 30 minutes than CBD oil. And as someone who's tried a lot of CBD products, please give me the flavorless packets over some slimy, bitter oil any day. I regularly have a packet of the Caliper CBD powder in my morning coffee because it helps me de-stress and get going, rather than fret about the stuff that adds to my depression or anxiety. I've noticed that I'm in a much better mood with a little bit of CBD in my system, and it definitely helps me relax as I'm getting ready for bed. And while I do enjoy partaking in the wacky tobacco from time to time, Caliper CBD is always THC free, because you sometimes just want to relax without any of the trippy side effects. Thankfully, Caliper's CBD powder packets are carefully measured to contain exactly 20 milligrams, so you can put zero effort into measuring out your dosage. Because not stressing about doses is the entire point, and Caliper can allow you to be lazy now too. Get some flavorless and effortless CBD with Caliper CBD today. Listeners can get 20% off of their first order with the promo code Unresolved at trycaliper.com/unresolved. You can try it risk-free for 30 days, and if you don't like it, Caliper will give you a full refund. Once again, you can take advantage of this offer by heading to trycaliper.com/unresolved. And don't forget to use the promo code Unresolved at checkout to save 20% on your first order. With a lack of leads developed outside of Dana Chisholm's apartment, investigators focused on the scene of the crime, Dana's apartment itself, where she had been killed. The apartment had been ransacked by her killer either before or after her death, looking for something, or anything. It was hard to tell because of how scattered everything was at the scene. It was theorized that during this ransacking of Dana's apartment, the killer might have discovered previous business cards left behind by Lieutenant Lewis Douglas with the Metro P.D, who had been there weeks beforehand to take the report of Dana's stolen television. It was believed that the killer might have used this information to make the phone call to Dana's parents just a few hours after her supposed time of death, in the early morning hours of February 27th. While this ransacking meant that police had a hard time identifying any kind of smoking gun, they did discover records kept by Dana herself, which included dates and times of interactions and encounters with various men. These were namely men that Dana had romantic or sexual encounters with in the past, which, as reported by the Washington Post, included telephone numbers and even workplace references for most of them. These were men that ranged from, quote, 50-something married businessmen who lived in the outer suburbs, to sports car driving club hoppers, to police officers. This revelation, that Dana had been seeing multiple men in the year and a half that she had lived in D.C., and had been keeping explicit notes of her interactions with each, was huge for investigators. It pointed to Dana being more involved in the region than anyone had suspected, as described by Sergeant Michael Farish to the Washington Post in 2011. She lived two very separate lives. We all think about the small-town girl who comes to the big city, meets predators who prey on her, and that leads to her demise. But that is not the case here. Dana was very savvy, She ran those 976 date type ads. We talked to several of the men. She'd sleep with these guys, then say things like, "My roommate moved out, and I could really use some help with the rent." It wasn't blackmail exactly, but the message was definitely that it might be in their best interest to pay her. To investigators, it seemed like Dana had been involved in sex work, but it was possible that she did not see it that way. Because she was now deceased, there was no way of getting her input, but it seemed like she had entered into romantic or casual relationships with these men, and then asked for money later on, perhaps subtly using the threat of exposing them to their family, friends, or colleagues to ramp up the intensity of the ask. I'm not quite sure if this qualifies as sex work, but perhaps it was. To me, this makes it likely that the ransacking of Dana's apartment was done for the killer to search for and remove any trace of himself, such as telephone records or other details written down by Dana. Investigators would go on to interview the many men that Dana had records of, which informed them how she had spent much of her 18 months in Washington, D.C. Many of these men were considered persons of interest in Dana's death, especially those that she had solicited money from after entering into romantic or sexual relationships. But due to a lack of information, none were ever developed into significant suspects. The evidence just wasn't there. Shortly thereafter, though, an odd lead would begin to develop in the background of this investigation. Sergeant Michael Farish was a supervisor for the Metropolitan Police Department's Homicide Division at the time of Dana Chisholm's murder, and was one of the only detectives interviewed by reporters at the time. For that reason, he was the only investigator quoted in the scant newspaper coverage of the case. Shortly after Sergeant Farish began looking into Dana's murder, he began receiving phone calls from a mysterious man with a raspy voice, who never gave his name. However, this man called whenever Farish was gone and left voicemails at Farish's desk, telling him that he should return his calls, without ever leaving behind a return phone number. However, after a couple of weeks, this man called when Farish was at his desk, and, as the sergeant later recalled to the Washington Post in 2011, he said, "I knew why she was dead, because of her lifestyle." This mystery man recounted details of Dana's private life to Sergeant Farish, including her constantly going out to clubs to drink and meet men, having sex with multiple men at the same time, etc. This rather abrasive caller seemed to put the blame on Dana for her own death, wanting Sergeant Farish to tell the public about Dana's private life. But while Farish wanted to earn the man's trust to hopefully learn more about him, he ended up doing the exact opposite. "I lied, I admit it," Farish later said to the Washington Post. "He was so adamant that I put those details out there that I put out just the opposite, hoping to draw him out." In a Washington Post article from March of 1995, Farish had portrayed Dana as a all-American type girl, the cheerleader, the type of girl that any mother and father hopes their son brings home. It seems like this treatment in the press irked this mysterious caller. These calls continued sporadically for a couple of months, with the man expressing resentment towards Sergeant Farish for how he portrayed Dana in the press, as a young, all-American, naive woman that had been taken advantage of by her killer, or killers. Eventually, this man said that he wanted to meet up with Farish to talk about Dana's murder. Farish agreed, allowing the other man to choose the spot where they'd meet up. At the stated time, Farish drove out there, eagerly awaiting to meet the man who was so opinionated about Dana Chisholm's murder. But this man never showed up, and from this day forward, went silent. Farish did not receive any more phone calls from the mystery man, nor did anyone else that we know of. It's unknown if this was the same man who had called Dana's parents early on the morning of February 27th, just hours after she had died, pretending to be another officer with the Metro P.D. But it's believed that these two men were one and the same, due to the details of their voice and speech patterns matching up. Police had been able to trace the call made to Dana's parents' home, determining that the call had been made on a payphone found near the corners of 4th Street and Massachusetts Avenue Northwest in Washington, D.C. This was approximately 4 miles away from Dana's apartment, but just a couple of blocks away from the D.C. police headquarters, leading some to believe that this killer may have been a police officer. If you recall, some of the men in Dana's notes had been police officers, At least 2 had been officers with the Metro Police Department. If anyone would know how to cover up their involvement in a crime like this, I would imagine it to be a police officer. Whoever this mysterious caller had been, he had also lied and told Dana's parents that she had been arrested for prostitution, which was evidently untrue. While we can semantically argue over whether or not she had been involved in sex work, she had not been arrested for prostitution or soliciting sex work or anything like that. In fact, as far as I can tell, Dana was not arrested for any crimes in the lead up to her death. But this killer seemed to enjoy telling Dana's parents that she had been arrested for sex work, which seemed oddly similar to the mysterious caller that had pressured Sergeant Farish into portraying Dana as a sex worker in the press. This leads me to believe that this man not only killed Dana, but likely wanted to destroy her reputation afterward. I'd be surprised if this man wasn't intimately involved with Dana, or at least obsessed with her to an unhealthy degree. It's even possible that he was the father of her unborn child, who was killed along with Dana nearly 30 years ago. In the weeks before her death, Dana had spoken to her parents and told them that she planned on driving home for a weekend to discuss something big with them. It's believed that she had been planning on telling her parents about her pregnancy, details of which she had already told some of her friends and co-workers, who recall her being less than positive about the news. Some co-workers recalled her crying at her desk when she first found out she was pregnant, which definitely makes it seem like the pregnancy wasn't planned. While the case remains unsolved, many hold out hope for answers to this day. Sergeant Micheal Farish continued to monitor the case for years, with the most recent press coverage of this story, a Washington Post article from 2011, detailing how he continued to search for answers and held out hope for some kind of resolution. While not much has happened in this story over the ensuing decade, I can only share in that hope that answers will one day be found. Until such a time, the story of Dana Chisholm will remain unresolved. Thanks for listening, everyone. I know it's been a while since I recorded an episode outro, but I just wanted to touch base with y'all and explain a few things. It's been a really long handful of months for me, as many of you may already know. Last year, my wife and I introduced a new member of our family, our daughter, who we love with all of our hearts, and I've become the de facto caretaker of her most of the time. My wife prefers to keep her life private, but she happens to serve in the military and has been very busy the last few months. Just turn on the news, I bet you'll see why. So things have been very hectic around the Whelan household. Anyhow, I just wanted to explain that this is why things have been so scattered on my end. I've been taking care of my daughter almost every day for the past handful of months, and the podcast has fallen down in my list of priorities for that reason. It's not that I don't want to work on the podcast, quite the opposite in fact. I just wish that there were more hours in the day for me to do so. This isn't an excuse, mind you, just an explanation for why things with the podcast have seemed so out of ordinary. Many of you online will notice that I've been very inactive on social media lately, and I have not been able to update the website in over a month. I do hope to get around to it soon, but I'm still trying to catch up on many things that have fallen by the wayside over the past 9 or so months. To add on to this, in late January I ended up coming down with a nasty cough and cold, which I later found out was COVID. While my wife never tested positive, she developed similar symptoms, as did our daughter for a brief period. I had it worse than both of them, having gotten my booster shot back in December, but thankfully I was feeling normalish within the month. When I recorded the last episode, the Katie Jeunesse story, I was still on the upswing, but I feel even better now than I did then, thank goodness. Now, with things developing the way they are in the world, I'm not quite sure when I'll have more time to work on the podcast. However, I am working hard to make things happen behind the scenes, which will allow me to get episodes out with more regularity. That includes not only these regular episodes, but the bonus episodes on Patreon. I already have a couple of bonus episodes on the way, and I do plan on having the second and third parts of the BTK story out in the near future, hopefully by the end of March. You all may notice a few of these shorter episodes every once in a while, which are a bit easier for me to research than the longer, in-depth stories that I typically focus on. But don't worry, these aren't going to become the norm. It's just a way for me to focus on the type of stories that I want to cover on this podcast without having to dedicate an entire month of my life on a case, which is typically what those longer stories require, believe it or not. I just wanted to let you all know where things stand, in an effort to be as transparent as possible. Like I said, I'm not trying to make excuses, just trying to let you all know that while things have not gone the way I'd hoped over the past handful of months, I am trying to make a regular schedule possible. Not only for the regular podcast on the main feed, but for all of the patrons who support this show. Anyhow, I'll stop blabbing. Thank you all for your patience and support. It really does mean the world to me. I'll be back with another new episode very soon, and patrons can expect some new content on their feed even sooner. Until then, take care, and I will talk to all of you later.